some coin collectors and numismatists and gold hounds really like early 20th century American gold coins. I know I count myself as one of them. One of my favorite gold coins from the early 20th century is the St. Gaudens $10 gold piece. Yeah, this was actually designed by Augustus St. Gaudens, the designer of the $20 Saint. This is a beautiful piece and one of my favorite gold pieces. Some people like the older coins. This is a great example of a $20 Liberty. This dates from the very beginning of the 20th century. Another interesting, great, big, beautiful, solid gold coin. Nothing wrong with that. I'm a big fan of those too. And some people prefer the St. Gaudens $20 gold piece that I just mentioned. This, considered one of the most beautiful coins America has ever released, it became a popular coin on the world stage and has remained one of the most popular gold coins in the entire American gold coin history. But there is one interesting gold coin that's about the same size as those $20 gold pieces and from about the same era as those $20 gold pieces that you might not have ever seen before. This is a fascinating and interesting coin full of intrigue and questions and all sorts of interesting history that very few people know about, and those that do know about them are often wrong about them. And that's what this journey is going to be about today. If you are new to the channel, my name is White Cross, and I want to thank you for being with me here on this journey. If you are one of my returning subscribers, thank you guys. I wouldn't be doing this without your support, and I love making new content for you guys. I want to thank you especially for being with me here. If you are one of those folks that sits in on the videos as they debut, that is a fantastic way to start the weekend. The 1945 Saudi Arabian 4-pound gold coin. Why did I use finger quotes there? Because it doesn't say Saudi Arabia anywhere on it. It doesn't say how much the denomination is anywhere on it. In fact, the only thing it says on it is United States Mint, Philadelphia, USA. So how did this coin come about? Where does it fit in the history of the American coinage study? Where does it fit in the world history of this period of time? We're going to get to a little bit of that in this video. If you are new to the channel, I like to begin each of my videos with a concept or two that we can work back into the meat of the video, what we're talking about in the video. And in this case, there are so many fascinating aspects of these pieces that I'm not even really sure where to start. So I think rather than starting with definitions, we're just going to jump right in and start talking about some interesting history. This all kind of goes back to before or probably the end of World War I, when America was trying to kind of decide where its allies in the world lay. And that kind of happened hand in hand with oil exploration. So in the 1920s and 1930s, the United States prospectors started looking for oil all over the world. And one of the places that they were focusing on was the Arabian Gulf. So they had groups of American oil companies. In this case, they included people like Standard Oil of California, Texaco, Exxon, and Mobil. And they were all exploring in the area of the Gulf there, right around the area of Bahrain, which is a small island country. And in 1932, they actually struck oil in Bahrain. And they immediately started to try to find oil on the Saudi Arabian mainland. Bahrain is just off the coast of Saudi Arabia, so it stood to reason that there was probably oil in Saudi Arabia too. Unfortunately, efforts to find oil in the Saudi Arabian mainland were not very effective. And consequently, this consortium of American oil companies that had kind of come together that formed the precursors of a company called Aramco. And you may have heard of that. They've been in the news quite a bit lately. They came together and they sold a 50% stake to Texaco. And once this Aramco precursor was revived, they were successful in finding oil in Saudi Arabia in 1936. So 1936, where is that? What's happening in the world? Where, of course, the beginnings of World War II are starting to happen. There are starting to be invasions. There are starting to be gearing up for what was going to be a protracted conflict. And with the end of World War I and the beginnings of World War II on the horizon, global warfare had shifted to something that was far more mechanized than people had ever experienced before. Big machines require lots of fuel. And all of a sudden, a place like Saudi Arabia, which had been almost off the maps for most of history, suddenly became a very important piece of this puzzle. Why? The United States of America had oil. We had oil in this country, and we were pretty much self-sufficient. We knew that we could tap our oil reserves if we needed to, and in fact we did. Saudi Arabia was much closer to some of the countries that we would soon be at war with. It was much closer to Italy, it was much closer to Germany and Japan, and America wanted to ensure that not only was Saudi Arabia going to be friendly towards us and our allies, but that they were not going to be dealing with the axis of evil, and then potentially even places like Russia, the Soviet Union, as World War II came to a close. So forming really solid ties with Saudi Arabia was definitely in America's best interests, and our State Department worked to make that happen. And it did. This consortium of oil companies was required to pay the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia a certain amount of money for all of the oil that they were pulling out of Saudi Arabia. In this case, it was the equivalent of 4 gold shillings. It's an interesting idea, an interesting thought. Saudi Arabia, like much of the world, had seen what had happened in post-World War I Germany, in post-World War I Hungary, when we had inflation and even hyperinflation to an alarming degree. Saudi Arabia and many people in the Middle East had never really trusted paper money. Saudi Arabia didn't have paper currency of its own. In fact, it didn't really have a mint of its own. What it used, Saudi Arabia, tended to use gold sovereigns, British gold sovereigns. This was the kind of the main workhorse coin that Saudi Arabia used in its currency. They also had circulating pieces from other countries. We've talked about Maria Theresa before. Smaller transactions were made with Maria Theresa dollars. This is an example of a Maria Theresa dollar from Austria. They also used rupees from India and around the area of India, what became Pakistan and what was Afghanistan. Those regions also produced coins similar to rupees or that were rupees themselves. So these were what Saudi Arabia wanted. This is what they traded in. And when they finally agreed to start selling their oil, they demanded a 4 shilling per ton fee from Aramco. And they wanted that shillings, those 4 shillings, to be in the forms of British sovereigns, gold sovereigns. So that's what the agreement was, and that's what they insisted upon. And you can see their fear of hyperinflation and their trust in solid gold. That was what they wanted to be paid in. So if we just take a look at it, the amount that they were paying was 4 shillings. There are 20 shillings to a gold sovereign, so 5 tons worth of oil per gold sovereign. That sounds like a pretty steep amount when you're just looking at things like the gold sovereigns. These are nice sized, solid gold coins with a long history, certainly trusted around the world, clearly trusted by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and that's how they wanted to receive their payments. A gold sovereign today trades for about $475. So we think that there were 5 tons of oil being traded for 1 gold sovereign. That means about $95 worth of gold on today's market would have paid for 1 ton of oil on today's market. How much is a ton of oil worth on today's market? Right now, a ton of oil is about $650. So you can see that this was, and if we assume that the ratio, the cost of oil to gold is probably pretty similar today as it was back in the 1930s, 1940s. Clearly, the cost has gone up considerably, but the ratio has probably stayed pretty similar. So even though Saudi Arabia was requiring essentially a $95 per ton fee paid in gold by Aramco, Aramco was receiving about $650 worth of oil for that fee. So it was definitely a lucrative proposition for Aramco, and you can see why they were so anxious to continue this. But Saudi Arabia were no fools. They knew exactly how much their oil was worth, and they demanded payment in gold for this reason. Unfortunately, the amount of sovereigns on the world market was becoming more and more difficult to obtain, especially for the quantity that was needed for Aramco to pay Saudi Arabia for the oil. And this is where the story starts to get a little bit murky. And this is where a lot of misinformation has been spread online. And I'll try to clear up a little bit of that. And in doing so, I'm probably going to stir up a mess of mud myself. But bear with me. This is a fascinating story. So the problems that America, with our oil, didn't need Saudi Arabian oil, but we wanted Saudi Arabia as a partner, as a strategic partner. We could see the writing on the wall in the future. We knew that World War II was coming to an end. Maybe didn't need them so much as a military friend, although we wanted that flyover capability that we could get from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, strategically located in an enormous country, and we wanted to be on good terms with them. If we needed flyover, if we needed oil, if we needed a strategic partner, we wanted to handle them with kid gloves. So Saudi Arabia is demanding payment in gold. The number of sovereigns on the world market starting to dry up a little bit because other countries like Saudi Arabia had also seen just how important gold can be in fighting things like inflation and hyperinflation. We've talked about that before with the restrikes coming out of places like France, the 20 franc pieces. People wanted to hold on to their gold. Now, there is some evidence to suggest that sovereigns were actually starting to appear on the market again, maybe not quite as tight of a market as some other folks have suggested when it comes to these pieces. But the truth is that there was also, in some cases, so many sovereigns available that they were being kind of sold at a discount. They weren't quite as popular as they had been. So the amount that they were worth was barely their gold value. It's an interesting dichotomy. The more pieces on the market, sometimes the lower the demand for it, even though these were a recognized and desirable form of currency. In 1933, the United States of America had outlawed gold ownership for its citizens. Now, if you know about Executive Order 6102, we've talked about it at length. It didn't really outlaw gold ownership for citizens. I have here $20, $40, $50 worth of gold coins from this era. The average American citizen could still own $100 worth of gold from this period of time. So imagine 5 $20 gold pieces, each one of these just about an ounce of pure gold. As I've said before, very few Americans today own 5 ounces of pure gold, but you could own that much in circulating gold coinage in this period of time. Another little bit of disinformation we'll try to dispel. The Executive Order 6102 really trying to call in the gold certificates so that the American Treasury didn't have to redeem gold anymore. That was the idea behind it. But part of this whole massive gold reduction plan was also to continue to allow foreign governments to purchase gold at our stated gold price through the gold window, this facility that was operated by the United States Treasury. And it was designed to keep the value of the American dollar up high overseas. If foreign countries knew that they could exchange American currency, paper money, for gold, that would bolster the United States dollar overseas. And as a result, they weren't really cashed in by foreign governments. It was just knowing that they had the option to do it that kept the value of our American currency high overseas, which during this period of time was considered to be an asset. So that was something we wanted to do. So we, the United States government, allowed foreign countries to exchange their gold, their paper currency for gold if they wanted to at the stated exchange rate of $35 per troy ounce. I'd love to be able to get that myself. I'm sure you would too. But like I said, it wasn't done very often. It was more just an option to keep those circulating bills, the value of those bills high. So Aramco needed to pay Saudi Arabia in gold sovereigns for the oil rights. I'm sorry, I just can't help sometimes picking these up and playing with them. I know you probably feel the same. Aramco needed to source these, and this is where some of the misinformation about the Saudi Arabian pieces come. The story is that because Aramco, an American company, needed sovereigns to pay Saudi Arabia, and the supply of sovereigns had dried up on the market, Aramco went to the United States Treasury, bought gold, had the United States mint these pieces into sovereign-sized pieces. This is a 4 pound, a pound being a sovereign. This is the equivalent of 4 gold sovereigns worth of gold. So this is exactly the same weight as 4 gold sovereigns, and a very rare situation in United States coinage. This is 22 karat gold. This is 91.67% pure, which just happens to be the standard that sovereigns are made to as well. You know that American circulating coinage of the time was 90% pure. So it is odd, and it's a strange, just a happenstance that we, the United States of America, happen to create sovereign denominated gold coins in the purity and the weight of a sovereign for exchange with Saudi Arabia. And that leads into this story that some people might kind of misunderstand. It all really started to take place in the 1950s with a numismatist named Harry Boesel. And he acquired one of these pieces in the early 1950s and became fascinated with them, trying to figure out what their history was. And he knew that there was an association with Saudi Arabia for these pieces, so he contacted the State Department. He wrote to the Saudi Arabian embassy. He wrote to the United States Mint. There wasn't really kind of the Freedom of Information Acts that we have now, so he got little half-truths, was blown off a little bit by them, but he eventually managed to kind of piece together the story of these. 1954, 4 pounds, 0.942 troy ounces, with a mintage of 91,210. There was also a 1947 release, just a couple years later, that was 1 pound. And it is exactly the equivalent of a gold sovereign. Same design, just a smaller rim around the edge, so it's really just this. I'll show a picture of one of those here as well. They weigh 0.2354 troy ounces with a mintage of about 121,364 in fact. They say on them, as you can see here, I'll try to get it nice and close so you can read it, U.S. Mint, Philadelphia, USA. And note that it doesn't say anything else on it. It doesn't say Saudi Arabia on it. It doesn't say 4 pounds, the equivalent of 4 sovereigns. It doesn't even have a date on it. So this is... you can see why people might misunderstand what was going on here. We'll take a look at the reverse here. And this is metal orientation, which is interesting. As we can see here, when you flip the coin over from front to back, it's upright. Unlike an American coin, if you flip it over from front to back, it's upside down. So this is coin orientation. This is metal orientation. And I love the reverse of this. You can see exactly what it says there. Gross weight 493.1 grains, net weight 452.008333 grams, or grains rather. And then it says fineness 916 2/3. So it doesn't say the date. It doesn't say the country. It doesn't say the ruler. It doesn't say anything else except for United States Mint, Philadelphia, USA. I think that's a very interesting point, and one I'm going to come back to a little bit later. So Boesel was studying these pieces. He found that there were 2 of them. He found that these were actually designed by the U.S. chief engraver, the 8th chief engraver of the United States Mint. His name was John Sinek. Does John Sinek's name sound familiar? John Sinek was the designer of the Franklin half dollar. And he was also, there we go, that coin orientation, right? You flip it over, it's upside down. He was also the designer, a little bit later, of the Roosevelt dime. So there we go. These are pieces that were designed by U.S. Mint engraver John Sinek. He was the chief engraver on these gold pieces as well. Now, they're not really a brand new design. When I first encountered these pieces, something about them seemed very familiar, and the fact is that the United States Mint, especially the assay offices, had been using a very similar design on the gold bars that they had been striking for a long period of time. So Sinek just kind of reworked that, and I'll show a picture of one of those here so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. This is a 1943 10-ounce bar from the assay office, And you can see the exact same design, just slightly reworked by Cynic there. The reverse of these pieces, and one of the reasons why I keep on bringing this into focus, is because these have always looked to me just like the San Francisco assay offices pieces of the Gold Rush, 1852. I'll show you an example of this piece and one that I think is very similar as well, so you can see just how similar it was. So these pieces have kind of a very familiar feel to them. There's something about them that just makes you go, oh yeah, I've seen that design before. I've seen that before. And I think that that was probably intentional too. They were trying to display just how solid and standard and organized and regular and familiar American gold was. They wanted it to be accepted. So the misinformation or the failure here was that Buzel, the numismatist who had first really kind of started working on these pieces, had kind of pieced together the story. America had produced these clearly. They were destined for Saudi Arabia. What was our relationship with Saudi Arabia? Why? We were buying oil from Saudi Arabia through this conglomerate of American oil companies called Aramco. And we had to pay them in sovereign denominated coins. They wanted sovereigns, and Buzel kind of stitched these pieces together and kind of came up with a pet theory that Aramco had bought the gold from the United States Mint. The United States Mint had minted them into sovereign-sized pieces because sovereigns were so hard to find on the market. And Aramco had used these pieces to pay Saudi Arabia for their oil rights. And that story has been perpetuated for years now. Buzel first wrote about these in the 1950s. And to this day, you can find these pieces when they are advertised. They are often said that they were used in payment for Aramco royalties. But it's not true. That's not really what happened here. And the truth is maybe a little bit more interesting in a lot of ways, but it may be a little bit more difficult to understand. So the problem is that with Executive Order 6102, American citizens and American corporations were no longer allowed to own gold. So Aramco, an American corporation, could not have come to the United States Treasury and paid for gold. It would have been against the law. They couldn't have done it. That right there just kind of nixes this entire story. But the story is so easy to understand that it's been perpetuated anyway. Aramco, an American company, could not store its purchased gold in the United States because that too was against the law. And we know this. We have seen articles, we've seen letters from the U.S. Mint and from the Treasury Department that state this outright. That Aramco could not have used their money to purchase gold from the United States Treasury. The United States Mint would not have made these for Aramco. And this is where it gets a little bit more murky. Is it possible that Saudi had agreed to take payment from Aramco in American currency with the promise that Saudi Arabia could come to that gold window at the Treasury? Remember, I said that foreign countries could, in fact, exchange paper currency for gold in the United States. Was Saudi Arabia assured that they could take Aramco payments in paper money and buy gold from the United States Treasury in exchange for that paper money? I think that's a possibility, and I hate to throw in something like that in the mix when we're trying to dispel some of the stories about these pieces, but that's at least a possibility. Where was Saudi Arabia getting its currency in the first place? Well, they didn't have a whole lot going on. Saudi Arabia was largely an undeveloped country at the period of time, and we know that Aramco was paying them enormous amounts of money for the oil that was being exported from Saudi Arabia. So is it possible that Saudi was taking those payments from Aramco and allowing the Treasury Department to turn those paper currency units that Aramco was paying to Saudi Arabia into gold? It's a slight distinction, but it's a very specific distinction. You see that Aramco wasn't buying the gold. They wouldn't have been allowed to. But is it possible that Aramco was paying Saudi and Saudi was buying the gold? I think it's at least possible. I think it's a plausible suggestion. Whatever the reason, and we'll get into a little bit later some of the people who have actually studied this at length and have come up with a lot more detailed responses to that question. We do know that America was trying to treat Saudi Arabia with kid gloves at this time. Like I said, we wanted them as an ally. We wanted to know that we had them as a strategic partner for their reserves, but also for flyover and everything else that we needed from them. And the writing was on the wall that the Soviet Union might become an enemy of the United States, and we definitely wanted Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf to be kind of more friendly to the United States. So, for whatever the reason was, Saudi Arabia contracted with the United States Mint to buy gold from them, and they originally wanted these gold, this gold in bars that were 5.5 ounces, 5.34 ounces, I believe. That's a difficult pour for any mint to make. So after they received their first shipment of these gold bars, and you can find gold bars on the market from the U.S. Assay Office that are from this period of time that are of this weight, and I think it's very possible that these are some of the bars that Saudi had originally commissioned. But it became a lot more obvious that what Saudi really wanted was sovereign-denominated coins. They wanted pieces that matched the gold coins that they were used to trading in their country because, honestly, they were probably going to take that gold that they got from us and convert it into sovereign-sized pieces anyway, and eventually they did do that. So the United States of America agreed to sell gold to Saudi Arabia at our stated price. I believe it was $35 an ounce. Saudi Arabia was all too happy to take that gold, especially when it had been minted into sovereign increment gold coins, like this piece here. And these pieces were shipped to Saudi Arabia. The idea was that they would become units of currency within Saudi Arabia. Now, the United States Mint had to tiptoe around this very delicately. Not only could Aramco not buy the gold directly from the mint or from the Treasury Department, not only could the United States of America not sell and store this gold for Aramco, but because of Executive Order 6102, Americans could not own gold coins. So if it got out that the United States Mint was minting gold coins for use by citizens of another country, I think they would have been in pretty hot water. And I think that even if you think about it today, if something like that were to happen, I would feel slighted by my own government and it would make me pretty hot under the collar. I wouldn't be surprised if you feel the same way. So the U.S. Mint had to really tiptoe around this. They didn't put a denomination on it. They didn't put a date on it. They didn't put any other information on it except for the seal of the United States Mint and also the contents of it in terms of gold. So this was really a bullion piece, and they could always fall back on that if they needed to. There were elements within the American society that were trying to kind of get gold back into circulation. And if the United States Mint had to defend itself, it could simply say, we have had a policy for years of selling gold to foreign countries on the open market. If they wanted gold in the shape of a coin, even though it wasn't a coin, at least it looked like a piece of bullion. And I think some people for a long time have considered these to be bullion pieces. In fact, if you know my channel, if you watch my channel, sometimes I consider pieces that I don't have to pay an enormous premium on, kind of more of a gold or silver stacking vehicle rather than a rare coin, and that's kind of how I have this one figured in my own collection. So the U.S. Mint and the Treasury Department kind of felt like they had their bases covered. These were bullion pieces. These aren't coins. They didn't have the Saudi Arabian ruler's picture on them. They didn't have a date on them. They didn't have a denomination on them. It was just bullion. Saudi was just buying gold from the U.S. Treasury, and that's the way it was supposed to work. I think it's really a fine line that they tiptoed, but they tiptoed it, and it apparently was somewhat effective. Now, the funny thing about this is that America was selling gold to foreign countries, or at least had it pegged at $35 a troy ounce. But on the open market, gold was selling for substantially more. There are some sources that say that gold was actually trading for about $48 or $50 an ounce. Some of them say it was double that, $70 an ounce, double the $35 an ounce that we were selling to Saudi. So Saudi Arabia, even though we had already minted these into sovereign-sized vehicles, remember the 4 sovereign and the 1 sovereign-sized coin, Saudi was simply taking these pieces and selling them on the open market in India and China and getting $50, $60, $70 per ounce for them, literally doubling their money. And Saudi Arabia knew that there were some parts of the world where the sovereigns had become discounted, but pieces that had an American seal on them were seen as something very special. So the premiums on these was actually greater than it would have been for the sovereigns. Saudi Arabia was very clever about that. They knew that these pieces would be in demand, and demand increases price. So Saudi Arabia was taking delivery of this at $35 an ounce, probably, possibly at least, the revenue that they received from Aramco. And then they were selling these gold coins on the open market for as much as 2 times what they had just paid for them, without doing anything but having them shipped overseas. Saudi Arabia, pretty clever in that regard. So how do they compare? We'll do a quick comparison. The interesting thing about these pieces is that they're big, they are thick. This is a thick piece. Unfortunately, this is an older NGC holder, NGC, Numismatic Guarantee Corporation. We've talked about pieces like this before. This is a slab, a holder, third-party graded at AU 58 on a scale of 1 to 70. This is a 58, so this is technically about uncirculated, but it's a very high about uncirculated, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. It's not much far off from the size of the $10 gold piece that we talked about originally. The $10 gold piece, 27 millimeters, the 4 pound at 29.5 millimeters. So it's roughly the same diameter, but it's obviously a lot thicker. And also, rather than 90% gold, like the classic American gold pieces, again, this is made in crown gold. This is made in that same gold that sovereigns are made in, which is 91.67% or 91.7% pure 22 karat gold. So about the same diameter, just a little bit larger diameter than the $10 gold piece, but really as much gold or very close to it as the $20 gold piece. $20 gold piece, 34 millimeters, 33.44 grams of 90%, or the actual gold weight of 0.9675 of a troy ounce versus the 4 pound here at 0.942 of a troy ounce. So 0.96, 0.942. Very similar in terms of gold content, again, because this is slightly more pure. So this is a big gold coin. It may not look like it, but this is essentially the same size and weight as an American $20 gold piece. I first found out about these pieces probably about 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. And I made a mental note. I remember thinking, wow, that is really bizarre. That is really cool looking. I wonder if I can ever afford one of these. Of course, we all think back in the day that we're never going to be able to afford pieces like this. Very fortunate that I've got this piece in my collection. I'll tell you a little bit how I got there. Heritage auctions, and I've mentioned Heritage many times before, one of the places that I trust when it comes to buying interesting gold coins or coins of any kind, had a sale in September of 2017 with 3 examples of these. I'll put some pictures up here. They had an NGC graded MS62, they had an NGC graded MS61, and then they had this NGC graded AU58. So the other pieces were slightly higher graded than this piece. And I thought to myself, these are pretty basic design, right? There's nothing really fancy about this. Compare this design to, say, the St. Gaudens piece, where you've got just intricate detail from the olive branches to the rays and everything, but there's really not a whole lot of design going on for the Saudi Arabian piece. So what difference did a grade make? You know, what difference is there between a 58 and a 62 or a 63? Maybe a fewer rim bumps here or a little bit fewer scratches there along these really wide flat planes. But honestly, as long as the strike was good, and you can see the strike on the eagle's breast is pretty solid, you know, who cares about a couple of points, especially if it meant that I was going to be able to save some money. And per the listing for Heritage auctions, the highest graded one was going to go first. So the 62 auctioned first, and then the 61, and then the 58. And I thought to myself, boy, the strong money is probably going to go for the highest graded piece. So I will dump a bunch of bids on the lowest graded piece, and maybe I'll manage to get it. I dropped in a $2,400 bid, which with the juice, that's the auction, the buyer's premium. A lot of auctions charge an extra amount over and above your highest bid. That's kind of how they make their money. That's their commission, and it can be substantial. Be careful of those buyer's premiums if you decide to buy at auction. Really understand what those premiums were. In this case, my $2,400 high bid meant that I was actually obligated to $2,880. Now, I'm very fortunate that at the time, gold was only about $1,300, $1,400 an ounce. So in my mind, I was only going to pay about twice the gold value for the piece. But by the time the dust settled, The others sold for, the 62 sold for $3,600. The 61 sold for $2,640. And mine closed at $2,040. And that included the buyer's premium. So I really didn't pay much over the value of the gold for this piece. By the time all the dust settled and all the fees were charged, you know, I could have bought a pretty nice $20 gold piece and I would have paid more for it than I did for this piece. Now, at the time, I thought these were interesting. I thought they were unusual, and I definitely wanted one in my gold stack, but I didn't really know just how scarce they were. Interesting. I tout research. I'm constantly saying that this is an important aspect, and you should enjoy the research aspect of your coin collecting, because if you enjoy researching your pieces before you pull the trigger, or sometimes like me, after you pull the trigger, it just augments your enjoyment of the hobby. This is something you can spend hours doing where you don't have to pull the trigger on a coin to enjoy it. Just finding out about the piece can be as fascinating as dropping that bid and winning the piece. So what it turns out, I said before that the mintage of these pieces, the larger piece had a mintage of 91,000, the smaller piece 121,000. So we're talking well over 200,000 pieces combined. But NGC to date has graded only 378, and PCGS to date has only graded 133 of these. So the combined grades from both of the main third-party graders, NGC and PCGS, across all grades, from the very lowest to the very highest, is 511 pieces out of 200,000 plus pieces that were minted. So why did that happen? Well, like I said, Saudi Arabia got these pieces and immediately exported them to India or to China, where they were melted, and Saudi received twice the amount that they just paid for them. It was a great gig for Saudi Arabia, but it means that most of these pieces were melted instantly. They never even saw the light of day. Now, there were some rumors that some of these were held back for the American workers at Aramco in Saudi Arabia, and they were used as poker pieces for card games. That seems very unlikely. You know, these again are about the size of a $20 gold piece, so why would they be playing with these as if they were poker chips? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's more likely that handfuls of these circulated for a brief period of time in Saudi Arabia because they were already denominated in those sovereign sizes. And remember, Saudi Arabia, when it wasn't using Maria Theresa thalers, was using sovereign gold coins. These the same size, same weight, same purity as sovereigns. Some of them clearly saw circulation. This is a 58, which means it's technically has seen just a little bit of circulation. Now, we don't know if that is circulation or if it's just being tossed around and bumped around in a box somewhere, but it did see some use to some degree, and I'm fine with that. I think that's great. As I've said before, sometimes it's a coin is a little bit more charming when it's seen some use rather than just been squirreled away in a package somewhere and never seen the light of day. Most of these were melted. Consequently, very few of them survive. Now, it's very important to understand, if you want to find one of these pieces, that counterfeits have been made. Lots and lots of counterfeits. As I said before, this design element is quite simple. This is a really easy thing for a counterfeiter to duplicate. And counterfeiters had already started making counterfeit gold sovereigns, and we'll talk about those in some other videos when we talk about counterfeit gold coins, in this same region, because the sovereign was the coin of choice. This is what was being used. If there weren't any sovereigns to be found, goldsmiths in this region would make them for you of a very similar weight, of a very similar purity. They weren't trying to make fake gold coins for collectors. This was just the coinage that was being used. And if they had gold but they didn't have sovereigns, they would make gold sovereigns. And some of them look remarkably close to actual sovereigns. Some of them look ridiculously bad, and we'll definitely take a look at those in the future. But if you already had sovereign denominated pieces, and that's what these pieces were, and the design of these was relatively simple, and you knew that these pieces stamped with the American mark on them had a bit of a premium, because they were the same purity of gold, how easy would it be to melt down sovereigns and turn them into American gold pieces where you could get a premium for them just because they had that American stamp on them? And if goldsmiths were able to make competent copies of gold sovereigns, which have a very intricate design on them, We've talked about that before. Look how beautiful and intricate that design is. They could easily mimic these American gold pieces and turn a profit just using the exact same purity of gold. That 91.67% pure was already there for the sovereigns. Melt down a few sovereigns, make an American gold coin out of it, and you've immediately got a profit. So there were lots of fakes of these made probably before there was collector interest. They continue to make fakes of these now that there is very strong collector interest. So if you are going to pursue these, make sure you get a piece that has been graded by NGC or PCGS. Full stop. Don't even bother with a piece that hasn't been graded. One of the leading numismatists in these pieces is a man named Roger Burdette, who incidentally is an ANA Numismatist of the Year for 2023. Wrote a book on that, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the future. Roger claims that there are at least 14 known die counterfeits out there. So there are tons of these that have been faked. Again, do not buy these raw. Make sure you get a piece that has been graded by PCGS and NGC. In this case, I like this piece because this is an older slab, so it has maybe a little bit of protection added to it, in that it's unlikely that somebody could have faked this piece in the last 20 years because it's been sitting in this slab for about that long. So, lots of fakes. Be careful with those. Interestingly, in about 2019, after I was able to acquire this piece, my understanding of these pieces, my knowledge was increasing. I was researching them, trying to find them, and I wondered, why weren't these pieces included in the Red Book? Why weren't these there? Again, they don't say Saudi Arabia on them. They don't have a date on them. They're not denominated in pounds or in kirches or in any other increment of money that could be used in Saudi Arabia. These are American as American gold coins could possibly be. So why weren't they included in the Red Book? After all, Hawaiian pieces are included in the Red Book that were struck at the United States Mint. Philippine pieces struck at the United States Mint are in the Red Book as well. So why aren't these Saudi Arabian pieces in the Red Book? And I contacted the folks at Red Book, and I kind of made my case for them. And I wasn't expecting to hear much about that, but within a couple of days, I had been included in an email exchange, and I'm talking February of 2019, with the publisher for Whitman, who is the publisher of the Red Book. You can see the Whitman there. The publisher, Dennis Tucker, senior editors of the Red Book, Jeff Garrett and Diana Plattner, editor emeritus, Kenneth Bressert, the emeritus editor of the book, and one of the most famous numismatists of the 20th century, Q. David Bowers, was also included and responded in this email chain that we had going back and forth, arguing the pros and cons of including these gold pieces in the Red Book. Again, my thoughts that private issues that were not made by the United States government are sometimes included in the Red Book. So why not pieces made by the United States government? Hawaiian pieces struck at the U.S. Mint included. Philippine pieces struck at the U.S. Mint included. These pieces don't say Saudi Arabia on them. They are not denominated in some kind of weird currency that's not typical for America. All they say on them is United States Mint, Philadelphia, USA. And it seemed to be winning them over, and I thought for sure they would be included. But the emails went back and forth, and eventually they cited examples like the Ecuadorian pieces that say Philadelphia on them, struck at the Philadelphia Mint. Those aren't included in the Red Book, even though they do say Philadelphia on them as well. I personally felt that was kind of a weak argument, but, you know, these guys are the experts. And it eventually came down to Q. David Bowers and others in this email chain saying that they thought this was a great candidate for Mega Red. That's the larger size edition of the Red Book. Because it has more space, they had more ability to include pieces like this, and it looked like they were going to put these in the Red Book. And every year I get a Red Book and check to see, and every year I'm disappointed because they still haven't surfaced. Now, they made some pretty solid arguments. I felt my arguments were every bit as good as theirs. And I was delighted to be included in an email chain that included some of the pieces, people that I have been, studying for years and years of my own numismatic history. So that alone was a treat, and it was definitely something that I keep copies of and remind myself of occasionally. But I mentioned Roger Burdette earlier. Roger is an amazing researcher on numismatic articles. He has published so many articles, continues to crank out fascinating articles all the time. And he released a book recently called Saudi Gold and Other Tales from the Mint that includes an entire chapter on these pieces. And I feel that Roger is the expert on these Saudi Arabian gold pieces. He dispels a lot of those myths that we talked about. They weren't made by Aramco. They weren't made for an American company to give for oil rights. Scratch that out of your memory. You know, it might have been a fine line between Aramco paying dollars to Saudi and Saudi buying these pieces, but they are not Aramco gold. Dispel that myth right now. They really had almost nothing to do with Aramco. If anything, the United States of America was handling Saudi with kid gloves by allowing them to buy gold at $35 an ounce, knowing full well that Saudi was going to sell it on the open market for nearly double that amount. But that was worth it for the State Department to solidify those ties with Saudi Arabia. And maybe that is a more interesting story anyway. So not Aramco, nothing to do with it, really. And if you want the detailed information, order a copy of Roger's book. I'll include a link in the description of this video down below. The articles in that book touch on other subjects as well, including Benjamin Franklin and also Roosevelt. There are secrets of the Treasury during the war, and a lot of other interesting things like coin collecting during the Depression. I didn't even think that was a thing, but Roger has written an entire article about that as well. So Roger, an expert in the field, he does not believe these pieces are Aramco. I agree with him. Pick up a copy of his book if you want a deeper dive into it. What do you think? Is that an American gold coin? Is this a gold coin from the United States of America? Should it be included in the Red Book? Does it not make any sense at all to include something like this in the Red Book? Do you have one of these? Do you want one of these? What are your thoughts about these pieces? Remember, these are incredibly scarce. Fewer than 600 have been graded so far. If you want to pursue one, make sure you get one graded by PCGS or NGC. Do not buy something like this raw. A very good chance that it's not an authentic coin. Unless you can buy it for less than the gold value, in which case definitely pick it up. Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this piece. Do you know about these pieces? Have you ever heard about them before? Do you want a deeper dive into them? Pick up Roger's book. I think you're really going to enjoy that read. Leave your comments down below. If you have questions about any of the pieces that we talked about here today, leave a comment down below. If you have suggestions for other video series you'd like to see me make, definitely leave a comment down below. Love to hear your opinion about it. And before I forget, thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey as you go deeper into the world of coins and physical precious metals.